Of Grammatology, published in 1967, and importantly for us, with an English translation in 1976, introduced the world to what its author, Jacques Derrida, would call deconstruction. The text would prove to be incredibly influential, and through its dissemination among philosophers and academia, become a mainstay of what would later be called post-structuralism. Post meaning after, and structuralism
meaning a search for regularities which help to explain how semiotic systems, such as a language system, genres, or cultural codes, work, through the structural analysis of texts or cultural practices reflecting their use, such as advertisements, films, or greeting rituals, which involves identifying basic signifying units within set structures and the relationships between these elements, developed as a response to the structuralist methodology.
And none of this is particularly important. You see, this understanding of deconstruction, what could for simplicity's sake be framed as Derridian, is difficult to pin down in any precise sense, as Derrida himself has provided contradictory positions on what deconstruction is. These conceptualizations range from a method of textual analysis to denying the very idea of any such thing as Derridian deconstruction in and of itself. But this video isn't about Derrida, not really. So for our purposes, I'll be using what I think is a very helpful understanding of Derridian deconstruction. Following some previous formulations, Jonathan Culler, author of On Deconstruction, wrote, "To these formulations let us add one more. To deconstruct a discourse is to show how it undermines the philosophy it asserts, or the hierarchical oppositions on which it relies, by identifying in the text the rhetorical operations that produce the supposed ground of argument, the key concepts or premise." So this is Derridian deconstruction in a nutshell, and while there is something to the idea that Derrida informs what this video is about, it is through sheer presence that this is the case. Methodologically, however, Derridian deconstruction is wholly absent, despite the best efforts of the proponents of the pop cultural discourse. This absence is obfuscated primarily because of, let's call it, a disconnect between more theoretical or academic spaces and popular, let's go with fan discourse. The influence of Derridian deconstruction on literary criticism is well known, as deconstructive readings as a means of examining the supposed meanings of text found a receptive audience among literary critics and literary theory throughout the 1970s. And Derrida's contribution to post-structuralism is well documented.
That's exactly what he said.
From this point, it branched out into the wider social sciences, eventually finding a home in cultural studies, post-colonial studies, feminist studies, and, significantly, film studies. So let's talk about the other lineage of deconstruction. Let's talk about architecture. Deconstructive architecture, an influential architectural movement which developed in the 1980s, arose as a response to constructivism, a Russian avant-garde architectural movement which was mostly influential in the 1920s and 30s, as noted by authors Philip Johnson and Mark Wrigley. It is the ability to disturb our thinking about form that makes these projects deconstructive. It is not that they derive from the mode of contemporary philosophy known as deconstruction. They are not an application of deconstructive theory. Rather, they emerge from within the architectural tradition and happen to exhibit some deconstructive qualities. Once again, our subject is only tangentially related to architectural deconstruction, but it is this lineage, as opposed to the Derridian, from which the pop cultural form of deconstruction being examined descends. This is once again a very brief glimpse, but I find this quote from Johnson and Wrigley illustrative. It, a deconstructive architecture, exploits weaknesses in the tradition in order to disturb rather than overthrow it. Like the modern avant-garde, it attempts to be disturbing, alienating, but not from the retreat of the avant-garde, not from the margins. Rather, it occupies and subverts the center. This work is not fundamentally different from the ancient tradition it subverts. By inhabiting the tradition fully, obeying its inner logic more rigorously than ever before, these architects discover certain dilemmas within the tradition that are missed by those who sleepwalk through it. These ideas, dilemmas within the tradition, subverting the center, and obeying its inner logic are all fundamental elements in the pop cultural sense of genre deconstruction. So let's keep this in mind as we now return to film studies. The conceptualization of genre deconstruction isn't something you will be able to find among works involving literary deconstruction, nor even within the academic discipline of genre studies. No, this manifestation of deconstruction was developed in film studies, largely as an offshoot of the architectural deconstruction I just discussed, but many aspects were framed with Derrida in mind. Which is not to say that deconstructive readings of films didn't occur, far from it. Rather, the curious development of genre deconstruction discussed below skewed towards understanding filmic genre structurally, something both literally and metaphorically constructed. Two of the earliest adopters were Jane Fuhr and Thomas Schatz, both of whom had publications released between 1978 and 1982. Unlike earlier iterations, auto-deconstructing texts notwithstanding, filmic genre deconstruction was observed as being an intentional act by the writer or director themselves, taking well-known conventions and subverting them, to both comedic and satirical effect. The two texts, Fuhr's The Hollywood Musical and Schatz's Hollywood Genres, are of particular interest because both expand and demonstrate an earlier observation in film studies that genre films tend to develop cyclically, as explained by Fuhr. After an early period in which the conventions themselves seem fresh and noteworthy, genres have to keep giving us something new without sacrificing the appeal these conventions held in the first place. An appeal based in cultural ritual celebrated in genre films, and an appeal that made the genre popular to begin with. Filmmakers, that is, need to acknowledge within genre films the audience's growing familiarity with the language of the genre, their increasing genric literacy. Late genre films tend to expose the structure itself at the expense of a transparent conduction of the ritual value the genre carries. This notion of cyclicity will be of central importance when examining the pop cultural conception of genre deconstruction, but there's been a lot to keep track of, so let's review. Derrida's deconstruction is relatively spectral in this conceptualization. Subverting tradition through finding weaknesses, rigorously obeying an inner logic, can be traced to the traditions of deconstructive architecture. The model of genre having a cyclical life cycle was formulated through film studies. But you may have noticed that something is missing, something which is hinted at in the filmic treatment of genre, teased by the architectural tradition, but is never explicitly stated, always seemingly on the margins, just out of reach. It feels like we're missing a key ingredient. One of the more significant developments in the culinary world at the end of the 20th century was the development of molecular gastronomy, and arguably the most influential figures associated with this movement was the Spanish chef Ferran Adrià. The head chef of the restaurant El Bulli, his name became synonymous with the culinary discipline despite his personal disdain for both the name and his association with it. Adrià originally called his technique discourse, but after meeting with the nephew of food journalist Bob Noto, who was at that time studying architecture, he changed the name to culinary deconstruction. Some of Ferran's most successful and beguiling creations, which speak directly to this sixth sense, are the result of culinary deconstruction, which involves the breaking down of familiar dishes into their constituent parts, changing the physical identity of at least some of those parts, and then reassembling the pieces in new ways so that the dishes take on different forms while retaining sensory connections within their models. So this is it. This is the component of pop cultural deconstruction that is always already absent, but ever present in the discourse. The basic conceptualization of taking something like a genre, breaking it down to its core components, examining and then subverting conventions, and reconstituting it within the existing framework to breathe new life into the genre, isn't found in Derrida, deconstructivist architecture, or even film studies. It is culinary deconstruction, which has popularized this understanding of how deconstruction works. This is a Google trend chart comparing the relative frequency of specific search terms, in this case searches within the United States from 2004 to the present. The blue line is deconstructed food, and the red line is genre deconstruction. You will note that throughout the entirety of the period, deconstructed food is either always more frequent or precedes a spike in genre deconstruction. For our purposes, there are two significant periods. The first is here, two large blue spikes in frequency, which is then followed by a large spike in red. The date for this red spike is April 2007, and it signifies the first time there is significant enough interest in genre deconstruction that it supersedes the consistently more frequently searched term deconstructed food. And in the next section, you'll see why this date is significant, as we pass on from discussing the origins of this particular conception of deconstruction, and instead examine why understanding it through the lens of its culinary lineage is not only sensible, but explains how it became a recipe for disaster. Oh, the other significant period? This spike right here, which seemingly comes out of nowhere and in a period where there is no discernible difference between the frequency of search terms? The one which seemingly undercuts my whole argument? Well, the point in question is between October and November of 2004, and the explanation for this spike is actually quite simple. After a protracted battle with pancreatic cancer and while undergoing surgery, Jacques Derrida passed away on October 9th, 2004. We are haunted by him, still. The TV Tropes entry for Deconstruction was published in April of 2007, so now you know what the source of that first red spike was. This is important for two reasons. The first is that it is my contention that, more than any other source, TV Tropes is uniquely responsible for the pop cultural conceptualization of deconstruction, or genre deconstruction. And the second is that despite the traffic generated by this initial publication date, the official creation date of the deconstruction page is June 2007. The change between the entries is exceedingly minimal, but is nevertheless significant. The initial entry downplays the role of Derridian and architectural deconstruction, which has little to do with its meaning in fandom, and the official states that, while related, is much more complex than the trope. This is a tension which we will continue to witness until the present day. Because we'll be looking at approximately 15 years of edits, I've broken the timeline down into 6 distinct phases, which covers the major page edits and is typically characterized by a few key elements. But if you are genuinely interested in a more detailed breakdown of the entire history of the page, you can find a link to Appendix A in the description. Phase 1 lasted from April 2007 until November of 2009, about 2.5 years. The initial description of deconstruction is as follows. A deconstructionist show will not just make fun of its genre, but attack it. Often, it will show that the genre's tropes, consciously or not, represent a very dark moral. The most common way to do this is to take a trope, often a comic one, and play it utterly realistically, showing just how bad an idea it would be in the real world. So there are several components to this conceptualization. The scope is at the level of an individual show, which is then contrasted against the genre it is supposed to belong to. What is being deconstructed are genre conventions or tropes. The relation is adversarial. Deconstructions are necessarily attacks. As a result, the deconstruction is predicated on authorial contempt. Methodologically, the way this is achieved is by using an existing genre convention and playing it utterly realistically. The claim is that by representing some realistic outcome, the trope is shown to be feasible only because of its fictional nature, and by subverting it, its inherent stupidity is revealed. As genres exist mainly as conglomerations of conventions or tropes, a discerning viewer is then able to systematically separate good genre works from bad genre works. This methodology will be consistent throughout the development of the page, so it's important to develop a grasp of the mechanics at the outset. The other element which needs to be remarked upon is that the implicit nature of these expositions reveals an underlying darkness. It is important to note that the association of deconstruction with being dark is present at the outset, because this relationship will be subsequently downplayed, so much so that as early as April of 2009, there was already a proviso that dark and edgy does not equal deconstruction. Compared to the stability of Phase 1, Phase 2 only lasted for about 5 months, from November of 2009 until March of 2010. The definition gets a little more expansive, so to avoid a massive text dump, I'm highlighting the significant parts. No, it would not be cool if our fantasies were real, because our fantasies are usually rarely thought out, and as such, if real, would have terrible consequences and/or indefensible preconditions. Deconstruction occurs when you take a common fantasy, being a trope or a set of genre conventions or a typical plot, and attack it by showing how much it would suck if it were in fact real. In essence, deconstruction is reductio ad absurdum applied to genre conventions, tropes, fantasies. Nothing about the trope, or set thereof, is actually changed. It is played straight. However, it is played straight without ignoring or hand-waving the negative consequences or preconditions. Indeed, these consequences and preconditions are highlighted in gruesome detail, taking a cherished fantasy and showing it to have indefensible results. Of all the phases, Phase 2 is the most viscerally celebratory in its disdain for the genres it is supposed to be deconstructing. And while it does retain the conceptualization of functionally playing tropes straight, it narrows this by equating it with the rhetorical deployment of reductio ad absurdum. It really leans into highlighting the real-world consequences of genre conventions and doubles down on the intentionality built into the perceived deconstruction. Deconstruction and reconstruction become cyclical tropes. A set of conventions is established, the initial construction of the genre or ideas that are used in the story. This set of conventions is played straight until some author gets bored and decides to show us the dark side of these conventions via a deconstruction of them. Atop the ruins, a more realistic narrative, i.e., one that accepts the criticisms of the earlier deconstructions, is then built via reconstruction. And in the future, this narrative gets deconstructed, etc. The idea of cyclicity, deconstruction and reconstruction, being the engine of development of a genre is present in Phase 1, but this specific enumeration of it effectively demonstrates the significance afforded deconstruction to genre as a whole throughout the history of the page. It is also worth noting that any reference to Derrida or architectural deconstruction has been removed, and as it turns out, the most impactful change produced during this phase. The third phase lasted from March of 2010 until September of 2011, about 1.5 years, and what is most striking about this iteration is how markedly different the tone is from Phase 2. There is an air of professionalism which will become the mainstay in terms of tone. The edge is gone, but it never quite relinquishes the contempt. Deconstruction is taking a fictional element, usually a trope or genre, that is usually seen as a nice thing, and showing this element to be poorly thought out, impractical, and/or much less nice than commonly assumed. What is most interesting about this phase is that there was an attempt to methodologically delineate two approaches which were observable in the work itself. At risk of generalizing, there are two ways to do this. The most common way is to play the element perfectly straight, but to show the kinds of usually unpleasant effects this would have in the real world and on real people. This method is analogous to reductio ad absurdum. Look at the kinds of real-life circumstances and/or types of people that would be required to produce this element in the real world, whereas the method looks at the undesirable real-life consequences of the fictional element, this method looks at the undesirable real-life causes of it. And of course, both techniques can be incorporated into the same work. As it will eventually develop, this delineation will not outlast the third phase, but rather will be reincorporated back into a more homogeneous description. The other significant development during this phase is that there is finally a formal separation between deconstruction and genre deconstruction, the later receiving its own page, which, as it turns out, is remarkably similar to the main deconstruction page. A subtrope of deconstruction, genre deconstruction, occurs when the author of a work performs a deconstruction on a specific genre. The genre is basically boiled down to a set of tropes, conventions, and a typical premise. All of these features are then played straight, with the unpleasant consequences and/or causes of these features highlighted. Basically, the fictional world is made realistic in order to criticize the genre's conventions and to show exactly how unfantastic, unfun, and uncool they would be in reality. This distinction without a difference will be addressed in Part 3. Phase 4 lasted from September of 2011 until February of 2012, or about 6 months, but this belies the significance this phase will have on the future of the page, something that will become clear in Phase 6. After significant bloat to the page, the entry was streamlined, but there is a significant addition to the definition. Deconstruction literally means to take something apart. As one might expect, this is a very broad term with a number of different definitions in literary criticism, theoretical physics, and even played old demolitions. Some of these are explained in more detail on the Analysis tab. When applied to tropes or other aspects of fiction, deconstruction means to take apart a trope so as to better understand its meaning and relevancy to us in real life. This often means pursuing a trope's inherent contradictions and the variance between fiction and reality. This is the first time the article overtly talks about deconstruction as a process of taking apart a trope to understand it, where before this aspect was always implicit, though the reliance upon contrasting fiction with reality remains consistent, if more clearly delineated. The other interesting development during this phase was the creation of the Not a Deconstruction subpage, which suggests two things. First, that there was a consistent discourse among the wider community to merit a secondary page to include media which did not meet the criteria of the main page editors, and two, that the conceptualization of what counted as a deconstruction remained contested. Also, Derrida is not only welcome back to the page, but for the first time given a place of prominence, as this entry claims the methodology derives from the literary application of Derridian deconstruction. Its meaning in literature was started by Jacques Derrida when he used the word to describe the process by which the connotations and concepts behind a word are explored and analyzed. When applied to tropes or other aspects of fiction, deconstruction means to take apart a trope so as to better understand its meaning and relevancy to us in real life. This often means pursuing a trope's inherent contradictions and the variance between fiction and reality. As it turns out, this would presage the shortest of all phases of the page. Phase 5 lasted from February to April of 2012, about 3 months, and was characterized by some editor doing their utmost to assert the importance of Derrida into the article. A lot of the core definition doesn't change, instead some expandable notes have been added. Its meaning in contemporary literary theory can be traced to Jacques Derrida, who deployed the term to describe the process by which the connotations and context behind a work are explored and analyzed in, often excruciatingly fine, detail. More correctly, deconstruction refers to the fact that the context and connotations behind a work are necessarily contradictory and artificial, and a deconstructive reading is the process of demonstrating this through close analysis. The simplest and most common method of applying deconstruction to tropes in fiction among general audiences and fan bases, and the method most relevant to TV tropes, takes the form of questioning, how would this trope play out with real-life consequences applied to it? This emphasis was ultimately short-lived, no doubt because the rest of the editors realized that Derrida was being shoehorned into the article, and they needed to maintain the distinction that had been present since the beginning. As it turned out, the most significant addition to the entry was the inclusion of the Tom and Jerry The Lost Episodes comic, which would become a permanent fixture on the page. The sixth and final phase, starting in April of 2012 and spanning nearly a decade, is the current form of the TV Tropes deconstruction page. The page was largely a restoration of Phase 4, so I won't be rehashing the description here. This iteration of what I will henceforth be calling Tropesian deconstruction will become the preeminent source for what a deconstruction is and how it is done, particularly among online fan discourse, but even creeping into professional and academic spaces. Encouraging and promulgating this model of a purely Tropesian deconstruction, by 2013, all references to outside influences had been scrubbed from the page, including Derrida, literary criticism, and architecture. If considered from the perspective of clarity and cohesion, this makes sense. The editors of Phase 6 clearly recognize that even mentioning Derridian or architectural deconstruction, neither of which had anything to do with their model, would only detract from the page. The only other significant change was that in May of 2016, the direct link to the anime and manga subpage was removed from the list of example subpages, located at the end of the article. This is noteworthy because the use of anime and manga in the examples had been a part of the page for most of its history, and its absence raises some questions I will be exploring in the next section. Given the longevity and stability of the page from this date onward, all previous iterations will take on a secondary or even tertiary significance. But it should be clear by this point that despite the many differences over the 6 phases, there have been very consistent through lines, and despite the best efforts of some of the recent editors, exercising these traces will prove to be quite difficult. In the description of her video, no, Puella Magi Madoka Magica is not a deconstruction, YouTuber Whimsy Dearest asked, so if you interpret Derrida differently or can find a way in which a genre can actually be deconstructed in the Derridian sense, please let me know your thoughts. It should be very clear by this point that Tropesian deconstruction, while always haunted by the specter of Derrida, had spent considerable time positioning itself as its own methodology. Indeed, the core stratagem of evaluating the logical consequences of a genre trope, if played out in a hypothetical real-life scenario, is not something you will find in any of Derrida's texts. Tropesian deconstruction has truly developed into its own creation and has embedded itself into the discourse of online fandoms. But there's a problem. Tropesian deconstruction is bad. I would go as far to say it's awful, and the remainder of this video will explain why. The stated purpose of Tropesian deconstruction and its end goal of having the meaning of a trope illuminate while coming to some understanding of it through taking the trope apart is never actually accomplished. This is what happens when you make the conscious effort to appropriate a term from cuisine and use it as an attempt to understand media. The reason that culinary deconstruction works is because of the fundamental nature of cooking. There are distinct ingredients. There are specific chemical processes. There are traditional recipes, there are chefs, and there are diners who will ultimately consume the dish. Well, okay, but there are also ingredients, a plot, character, narratives, etc. There are animation and drawing processes, there are genre conventions, there are authors, there is an audience who will ultimately consume the media in question. So how are these different? Well, herein lies the first problem. The former is the literal processing of food, and the latter is using metaphoric language to describe an observation of a work of media. It is the difference between eating a meal and watching an episode of an anime. They are ultimately different modes of consumption, and what's effective in one does not necessarily translate to efficacy in the other. The article pays lip service to the concept of taking apart the trope or genre convention, but fails to provide any demonstration of this occurring, whereas deconstructing, say, a salad is a relatively simple process with clear results, and so this brings us to the next problem. Every iteration of Tropesian deconstruction utilizes the same methodology for how the deconstruction takes place, and this is accomplished by appealing to real life. And for all the provisos about not having to discount magic, advanced technology, superpowers, and so on, what constitutes real life or real-life consequences is wholly arbitrary and never defined beyond a vague sense that the reader will get it. As it turns out, all this means is that the convention is subverted through the application of a thin layer of misanthropy. How exactly this is supposed to show the relevance to us in real life is never expanded upon. After pouring over 15 years of page edits, the only conclusion that can be drawn from this phrasing is that Tropesian deconstruction has determined that genre conventions aren't realistic because the audience can imagine a different outcome than the one portrayed. That's it. That's all the insight this supposed methodology is able to provide. None of this provides a whiff of critical utility, of analytic clarity, or even basic media literacy. And where there is the potential for something interesting to develop through the close examination of genre conventions, well, we already have perfectly apt descriptions for how an author would do this: parody, satire, and subversion. In fact, these are precisely the mechanisms used in filmic genre deconstruction, which I mentioned in part 1. And while the tropers thought of those and why they are not a deconstruction, the conceit is that because they don't achieve their purpose through playing it straight, which, as I think I've shown above, doesn't accomplish anything other than reminding us we are watching a work of fiction, and so they don't qualify. But it doesn't stop there. You see, in Derridian and literary deconstruction, the deconstructing is done by the reader and not the author. Deconstruction can be a way of reading, of analyzing a text, and is an active process. Yes, even in the case of so-called auto-deconstructing texts, the reader must still discover where this occurs. When it comes to Tropesian deconstruction, the deconstruction of the genre has already been made by the author, writer, or director, as an overt metatextual gesture with complete intentionality which is only apparent to the discerning viewer who is savvy enough to pick up on it. Except, the entire edifice of genre deconstruction is wholly dependent on the savvy viewer being able to understand that a deconstruction has taken place, to be able to weigh it against the entirety of a genre and judge it as effectively deconstructed. And so we arrive at the contradiction at the heart of Tropesian deconstruction. The intentionality of the author is completely dependent on the interpretation of the viewer. How can this be? In semiotics, a sign is composed of a signifier and a signified, and it is in post-structuralist discourse that we encounter the concept of an empty signifier, a signifier which has a vague or highly variable signified, a signifier which can mean whatever its interpreter wants it to mean. This is what Tropesian deconstruction is, an empty signifier whose meaning is determined by the individual who is observing it within a given media property. This also means that the concept is contested, and one need only recall that there have been at least 6 iterations of the same web page. Difference is enough among tropers themselves to merit the edit history explored in Part 2. And so the characteristics of the viewer which facilitates the self-assurance required to project one's own understanding of the value of a work back into it, contrasted with the entirety of the genre being deconstructed, it is something which requires examination. In his 2001 book, Otaku, Japan's Database Animals, author Hiroki Azuma proposes a model through which to better understand the patterns of media consumption he observed in Japanese otaku. He called this model database consumption. As a response to the postmodern condition, specifically the loss of the sorts of grand narratives which provided a sense of meaning during the first half of the 20th century, otaku established meaning through developing a grand non-narrative. Otaku are satiated by classifying the characters from such stories according to their traits, and anonymously creating databases that catalog, store, and display the results. Here, database is not simply the kind of computer program or website for storing and retrieving information that humans are finding it increasingly difficult to live without, but rather a model of a metaphor for a worldview, a grand non-narrative that lacks the structure and ideologies or grand narratives that used to characterize modern society. On its face, Azuma's observations appear to have presaged the creation of a webpage like TV Tropes, and its community of editors, or tropers, quite accurately. Indeed, the Welcome to TV Tropes page describes the page as follows. TV Tropes is a wiki, sort of like Wikipedia, but using different software and with a different purpose. We describe and collect examples of tropes in media. We also host reviews, live blogs, and have forums, where you can talk with other tropers. The mission statement which follows is also revealing, as it sets out 4 basic principles about the site. The wiki is about tropes used to tell stories. We will be accessible and fun to read. The wiki is for reaching the reader. In order to be accessible, we cannot be locked into a specific fandom's viewpoint. The last thing to mention is that on the page detailing what a trope is, the page expands the scope of tropes to encompass not only their limited use as components of the creation of fiction, but also in related aspects such as behind-the-scenes aspects of creation, the technical features of a medium, and the fan experience. The idea being that storytelling is not just writing, it is the whole process of creating and telling or showing a story. With all this in mind, it becomes abundantly clear that despite its pretenses to fun, The site runners, and by implication the troper community at large, genuinely believes there is value, analytic and critical value, in the collection, examination, dissection, and creation of what the community deems tropeable facets of media and media production. The site takes itself seriously as a resource for educating the wider public on tropes, and as the fourth principle obfuscates its commitment to some objective standard by substituting it with the word accessibility, effectively sidelining specific fandoms' viewpoints in service to neutrality, we can begin to see the underlying ethos of TV tropes, which necessarily bleeds into Tropesian deconstruction. The core ideological position of TV tropes is that tropes are not only the building blocks of storytelling, they are the constituent parts of the entire process of media production and consumption. This is what makes the cataloging of tropes valuable to a troper. Consumption of the database will allow one to develop an understanding of the media being consumed. And here we return to the fundamental problem. This model of consumption does not translate to an effective media literacy. It merely provides the appearance, the affect, but this affect is built on a foundation of empty signifiers, Tropesian deconstruction the chief among them. However, for people, and this could be expanded to fan communities more broadly, whose primary basis for interpreting media is through the Tropesian lens, the fact that tropes are ultimately empty signifiers is perhaps why the model remains as popular and as influential as it has been. Because the meaning of tropes, their perceived value, is determined solely through the perspective of the person, and by proxy community, determining them. And it is here where the nature of the fourth principle exposes how arbitrary the concept of Tropesian deconstruction really is. You see, the sort of deep understanding of a genre which would characterize someone who would consider themselves a fan of the genre preclude the facile familiarity required to declare X show to be a deconstruction of Y genre. And this is nowhere more apparent than in the anime and manga deconstructions subpage. Neon Genesis Evangelion has of course been the gold standard of anime deconstruction. It was, after all, the first example of a Tropesian deconstruction from the beginning of the page up until 2016, and even otherwise sensible individuals who can recognize that, say, Madoka is not a deconstruction of the Mahou Shoujo genre, have accepted this. I don't want to retread well-worn paths. The Whimsy Dearest video I mentioned earlier provides a good explanation of why Madoka isn't a deconstruction. Similarly, Matteo Watsky's seminal essay, Evangelion, You Can Not Deconstruct, explains in considerable detail why Evangelion is not a deconstruction. Looking at some other examples which I haven't seen discussed before reveals precisely this pattern being repeated again and again. All of these can be found on the current anime and manga deconstruction page, which has to be accessed via genre deconstruction. Rurouni Kenshin is presented as a deconstruction of Jidai Geki, or period dramas, because instead of glorifying what life was like for the samurai, it represents psychological trauma. Whoever included this doesn't know the first thing about Jidai Geki, let alone the Chambara subgenre, because depictions of moral ambiguity, trauma, and the futility of violence have been core tenets of the genre since its inception. The entry for 12 Kingdoms actually includes internal debate about what it is supposed to be deconstructing. It's presented as a deconstruction of isekai, showing how difficult life would be for a normal person suddenly transported into a fantasy world, and issues of isekai lineage notwithstanding, that individuals face hardships in the new world isn't even an inversion. It's one of the primary sources of conflict within the genre, if not in fiction in general. Patlabor is listed as the ultimate deconstruction of the mecha genre, because the robots are considered to be utilitarian and are not cool. This fails the basic premise of Tropesian deconstruction, as it doesn't even explore the real-life consequences. It simply tells a story where mecha have been incorporated into the existing economic and political system. This is basic science fiction. A Place Further Than the Universe is presented as a deconstruction because, unlike all those other schoolgirl shows, these four girls' past and present struggles are explored? All things explored in series like Comic Girls or Hidamari Sketch, to name but a few, But again, there's also nothing about the realistic consequences of playing tropes straight in the entry. Finally, the world God Only Knows is presented as a deconstruction of the dating sim game genre, because its central premise is that the characters in dating sims are different than how girls act in real life. Except this doesn't even fit the criteria for deconstruction, because the real-life consequences of the world behaving like a dating sim are never discussed. Now, these are 5 shows pulled from the 50 or so series currently listed, so I'm going for brevity rather than breadth, but in closing, and with these examples in mind, let me reiterate. There is an observable pattern of ignorance of the genre being deconstructed, which is leveraged to criticize the genre when the troper finds something they think is subversive. Ignorance becomes a strength. The criteria for deconstruction is incredibly arbitrary, solidifying my contention that deconstruction is an empty signifier, becoming whatever the person needs it to be. The basis for deconstructive intentionality on part of the author is solely determined by the troper. With all this said, it should be clear by now that Tropesian deconstruction is meaningless. It leverages ignorance to present itself as insightful analysis, but ultimately reflects nothing more significant than an individual's contempt for the genre being deconstructed. It presents an image of media literacy, but its entire premise is a facade, substituting critical engagement with surface-level analysis through the use of the Tropesian database in a solipsistic frenzy of empty signification.